The alarm bells rang across the Vorthan border station like angry metal birds screaming in the void, and Captain So-Min knew her luck had finally run out after 3 months of running from shadows and ghosts in the empty spaces between stars where no sane pilot would dare to fly. But she had no choice, because the message she carried was more important than her life or the lives of anyone on this station, or maybe even the lives of everyone in the galaxy. Her scout ship Wandering Star was dying around her, and she could smell the burnt circuits and melting plastic that meant life support would fail in maybe 20 minutes if she was lucky, and 10 if she was not, and the Vorthan ships were already moving to intercept her with their massive hulls bristling with enough weapons to turn a small moon into space dust. But they would not fire yet because they were curious about this strange little ship broadcasting codes that had not been heard in the galaxy for 300 years. Admiral Kang Ho stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Glory and watched the tiny human vessel limping toward his fleet like a wounded animal seeking shelter, and he felt nothing but contempt because humans were supposed to be extinct, or at least so primitive that they posed no threat to the mighty Vorthan Empire that had conquered half the galaxy through superior technology and absolute ruthlessness in the pursuit of galactic dominance. The human ship was broadcasting something in an old frequency that made the communication officers frown and check their equipment twice because the signal was clean and strong despite coming from what looked like a ship held together with prayer and stubbornness, and when they finally decoded the message, it was simple and strange and somehow terrifying in its calm certainty. So-Min spoke into her microphone with a voice that shook only slightly because she had practiced this moment in her mind for months during the long journey back to civilized space, and she knew that everything depended on getting the words exactly right, because there would be no second chance and no forgiveness for failure. Her message was broadcast on all frequencies and in 17 different languages, including some that had not been spoken in the galaxy for centuries, and it said simply that the humans were coming home and that everyone should prepare because the old warnings had been true and the sleeping giant was finally waking up after a very long and very educational dream. The Vorthan boarding party found So-Min unconscious in her pilot's seat, with her hands still gripping the controls and her body showing signs of radiation exposure and malnutrition that spoke of a journey through regions of space that no civilized being would voluntarily enter, and when they tried to access her ship's computers, they found systems that were both impossibly advanced and strangely familiar, as if someone had taken Vorthan technology and evolved it in directions that made no logical sense. Admiral Kang Ho interrogated the human woman personally because he was curious about this primitive species that had supposedly vanished from galactic civilization 3 centuries ago, when their homeworld, Earth, had been declared a dead system after some kind of ecological disaster that had forced the survivors to flee in slow-generation ships that most experts believed had failed somewhere in the dark between the stars. So-Min told him about the return fleet and the things her people had learned during their long exile in the dangerous regions beyond the galactic rim where ancient machines still functioned and dead civilizations had left behind secrets that were not meant for younger races to discover. But humans had always been stubborn about rules and warnings and signs that said to stay away. She spoke of ships that could phase through normal matter and weapons that could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics in small local areas, and humans who had changed themselves in ways that made them something more than the primitive bipeds that had fled Earth all those years ago when the galaxy had made it clear that there was no place for humanity among the civilized races. Kang Ho laughed because the human woman was obviously suffering from radiation-induced hallucinations, and even if her people had survived their exile, they would still be flying in the same slow, primitive ships that had carried them away from Earth, and using the same crude technology that had barely allowed them to reach space in the first place. But Elder He-Ri of the Zelixian Council was not laughing when she heard the recordings of So-Min's interrogation because she was old enough to remember the stories that the younger races preferred to forget, and she had access to archives that most beings did not know existed, and she knew that the humans had left behind more than just warnings when they departed from galactic civilization. The old records spoke of a species that had appeared in the galaxy like a sudden storm, and had refused to follow the established rules of conquest and submission that governed relations between the civilized races, and instead had insisted on concepts like cooperation and mutual aid, and the crazy idea that all sentient beings deserved respect regardless of their military power or technological advancement. The humans had been different from the beginning, and not just because they came from a world that most species would consider uninhabitable with its violent weather and dangerous wildlife, and the strange way that all life on Earth seemed to be engaged in a constant struggle for survival that had produced beings capable of adapting to almost any environment or challenge. When the galactic powers had finally united to force humanity to accept their proper place as a client, species serving their betters, the humans had simply refused. And when economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure had failed to bring them to heel, the great powers had prepared for war, expecting to crush this upstart species in a matter of weeks. But the humans had surprised everyone by simply leaving, and their final message had been broadcast from their last ship as it disappeared into the void beyond the galactic rim, and Elder Hy-Ree still remembered the exact words, even though they had been sealed in the forbidden archives for 3 centuries to prevent them from inspiring other primitive species to similar acts of defiance. The message had been delivered by a human woman whose name was lost to history, but whose words had been preserved exactly as she spoke them, and she had said that humanity was going into exile not in defeat, but in preparation, and that they would return when they had learned what they needed to learn. And when they did return, the galaxy would finally understand what true strength meant. Now Elder Hy-Ree sat in her private study surrounded by documents that officially did not exist, and she traced the ancient words with one clawed finger while her old heart beat faster because she could feel the truth in her bones the way that very old beings sometimes could, and she knew that the warnings were about to prove themselves accurate in ways that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Meanwhile, Admiral Kang Ho was mobilizing the largest fleet in Vorthon history because even if the humans had somehow survived their exile, they were still just one primitive species facing the combined might of an empire that controlled thousands of star systems and commanded technology that could crack planets and boil away the atmospheres of worlds that dared to resist. His war council gathered in the flag bridge of eternal glory, and they made their plans with the casual confidence of beings who had never lost a battle and never encountered an enemy they could not crush through superior firepower and tactical brilliance. And they spoke of the coming engagement as if it were already over, because how could primitives who had been hiding in the dark for 3 centuries possibly challenge an empire at the height of its power? But deep in the sensor arrays that monitored the approaches to Vorthon space, something was happening that made the technicians check and recheck their instruments because they were detecting energy signatures that matched no known technology and were approaching from the direction of the galactic rim, at speeds that should have been impossible for anything larger than a single scout ship. The readings were so strange that the first officer thought they might be looking at some kind of natural phenomenon like a rogue pulsar or a wandering black hole, but the patterns were too regular and too purposeful, and as the signatures grew stronger, it became clear that they were looking at artificial constructs of enormous size, moving through space in perfect formation. Admiral Kang Ho received the report while he was reviewing battle plans, and at first he dismissed it as sensor ghosts or equipment malfunction because the energy readings suggested objects that were larger than his largest dreadnoughts but were somehow managing to travel at speeds that would tear apart any known material, and were doing it without leaving the kind of wake that massive ships should leave in the fabric of space itself. But as the hours passed and more reports came in from other sensor stations, it became impossible to ignore the growing evidence that something unprecedented was approaching Vorthon space, and that whatever it was would arrive within days rather than weeks or months. The last report came from the furthest sensor buoy at the very edge of Vorthon territory, and the message was simple and clear and absolutely terrifying, because it meant that everything Admiral Kang Ho thought he knew about warfare and technology and the balance of power in the galaxy was about to change. Forever. The human ships appeared on every sensor screen in Vorthon space, like impossible dreams made real, and Admiral Kang Ho felt his confidence wavering for the first time in his military career as he stared at the tactical display that showed 12 vessels, each one dwarfing his flagship, and moving through space with a grace that seemed to mock every principle of physics he had learned in the Naval Academy. Captain Jae-min commanded the lead human vessel from a bridge that looked nothing like the sterile military spaces that dominated Vorthon ship design, and instead resembled something between a garden and a library, with living walls that seemed to pulse with their own internal light and control surfaces that responded to thought. As much as touch, his crew moved with the easy efficiency of beings who had spent generations learning to work as extensions of each other and their ship, and when they detected the Vorthon fleet massing to intercept them, they felt no fear or anger, but only a deep sadness that their homecoming would begin with violence instead of the reunion they had hoped for. The Vorthon fleet that Admiral Kang Ho had assembled was the largest in the Empire's history, with over 1,000 ships arranged, in perfect battle formation and carrying enough firepower to sterilize entire solar systems. But as the human vessels approached with their impossible size and their strange energy signatures that seemed to bend space around them, the Admiral began. To understand that numbers might not be enough, Dr. Yujin worked frantically in her laboratory trying to understand the technology they had recovered from the human scout ship, and what she found made her question everything she thought she knew about the laws of physics, because the human systems seemed to operate on principles that should not work, but clearly did, and in ways that suggested a fundamental understanding of reality that went far beyond anything in Vorthon science. The human computers were not really computers at all, but something more like crystallized thought that could process information at speeds that made quantum processors look like primitive mechanical calculators, and the power systems drew energy directly from the quantum foam that most scientists believed was purely theoretical. When Captain Jae-min broadcast his message, it came through every communication system in the Vorthon fleet simultaneously, despite the fact that they were using supposedly secure military frequencies and encrypted channels that should have been impossible for outsiders to access. His voice was calm and pleasant, and spoke perfect Vorthon with an accent that suggested he had learned the language from someone who had been away from home for a very long time, and his words carried a weight of authority that made even Admiral Kang Ho pause before responding. The human captain explained that his people had spent 3 centuries learning from the ancient races that had built the galaxy's first civilizations, and had discovered technologies and ways of thinking that had been lost for millions of years, and that they wanted nothing more than to share these gifts with their old neighbors and perhaps find a way to build something better together. Admiral Kang Ho's response was swift and decisive, because he had not risen to command the Imperial fleet by showing weakness or uncertainty in the face of potential threats, and he ordered his entire battle group to open fire with everything they had, because overwhelming force had always been the Vorthon way. The barrage that erupted from 1,000 ships should have been enough to crack moons and boil away oceans, but the human vessels simply absorbed the energy like sponges soaking up water. And what happened next would be recorded in military histories as the moment when the old galaxy died and something new was born. The human ships did not return fire in any conventional sense, but instead projected fields of some kind that reached out and touched every Vorthan vessels simultaneously, and suddenly weapons stopped working and engines shut down, and life support systems switched to emergency power as if someone had reached inside each ship and gently turned off everything that could be used for violence, Captain. Jamin's voice came through the communication systems again, and this time there was a note of disappointment that cut deeper than any threat could have, and he said that his people had hoped for a peaceful reunion, but that they understood the galaxy had not learned the lessons they had hoped it would during humanity's absence. Admiral Kang Ho found himself drifting helplessly in space along with his entire fleet, and when his engineers tried to restart their systems, they discovered that nothing was broken or damaged, but simply would not respond to commands, as if the ships themselves had decided to stop being weapons and had chosen to become something else. Instead, Commander Tae-wan of the Kathrani forces had been watching the engagement from a safe distance, and what he saw challenged everything he believed about military tactics and strategic planning. Because the humans had not defeated the Vorthan fleet so much as they had made the very concept of fleet combat irrelevant. The human technology seemed to operate on principles that went beyond mere physics and entered the realm of something that could only be called magic if one believed in such things. And Commander Tae-wan was beginning to suspect that perhaps the old stories about sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic had been more accurate than anyone had realized. Dr. Eugen's analysis of the captured scout ship revealed systems that seemed to grow and adapt in real time, and materials that could change their fundamental properties based on need and purpose, and power sources that appeared to tap into dimensions that most physicists believed were purely mathematical constructs with no physical reality. The human vessels themselves seemed to be alive in some way that defied easy categorization, and their hulls rippled with patterns of light that suggested vast internal processes that had nothing to do with conventional engineering and everything to do with a kind of technology that had evolved beyond mere mechanical function into something approaching consciousness. When Admiral Kang Ho finally managed to establish communication with his paralyzed fleet, he discovered that his crews were unharmed but thoroughly demoralized because their most advanced weapons and defensive systems had been neutralized so easily that it seemed almost casual, and they were beginning to understand that they were not facing an enemy, but rather something so far beyond their capabilities that resistance was not just futile but meaningless. The human ships began to move through the disabled Vorthan fleet, like shepherds moving among sheep, and everywhere they passed, the alien vessels found their systems returning to life, but changed in subtle ways that made them more efficient and less dangerous, as if someone had reached into their very design and improved them while removing their capacity for causing harm. Captain Jamin broadcast a second message that was heard throughout Vorthan space and beyond as other galactic powers monitored the situation with growing alarm, and his words were simple and direct, and carried implications that would reshape the political landscape of the galaxy. He explained that humanity had not returned to conquer or destroy, but to offer a choice, and that every species in the galaxy could continue as they were, or they could join the humans in building something new and better, but that the old ways of dominance and submission and endless conflict were ending whether anyone wanted them to or not. Commander Tae-wan realized that he was witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history, and he began to wonder if perhaps the humans had been right to leave all those years ago, and whether their exile had been less a retreat than a strategic withdrawal, to gain the knowledge and power necessary to return as something more than just another competing species. The reports that reached the Galactic Council painted a picture of human capabilities that seemed impossible, but were supported by so much evidence that denial became increasingly difficult. And the various species that made up the galactic community began to realize that their assumptions about humanity and about the nature of power itself were about to be challenged in ways they had never imagined. Dr. Eugen's final report on the human technology concluded that it represented a fusion of science and something else that could only be called wisdom, and that the humans had somehow learned to work with the fundamental forces of reality rather than against them, and had developed ways of thinking and being that transcended the limitations that other species had always accepted as unchangeable. The human fleet that had seemed impossibly large when 12 ships arrived was revealed to be merely the advance guard when long-range sensors detected the approach of something that defied comprehension and made the first group look like a scouting party sent ahead of an army that numbered in the thousands and carried technology that seemed to operate according to rules that no other species had ever discovered. Admiral Kang Ho sat in his command chair, surrounded by systems that worked perfectly but would no longer obey commands to cause harm, and he stared at the tactical display, showing human vessels that moved through space like living things, and he began to understand that everything he had believed about warfare and power and the natural order of the galaxy had been nothing more than the delusions of children playing with toys they did not understand. Fleet Admiral Min Ho stood at the center of his flagship's command sphere and watched the galaxy spread out before him like a three-dimensional map made of light and possibility. And he felt the weight of 300 years of preparation and learning and evolution pressing down on his shoulders as he prepared to make the decisions that would determine whether galactic civilization would grow or simply end. The human fleet that emerged from the dark between galaxies was unlike anything that had ever been seen in this region of space, and each vessel seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with hulls that shifted between solid matter and pure energy, and weapons systems that looked more like works of art than instruments of destruction. Captain Yun-ji, prepared for what might be the most important diplomatic mission in the history of either species, and as she reviewed the cultural files that her people had compiled during their long exile, she felt a mixture of hope and sadness because the galaxy they were returning to seemed to have learned so little during humanity's absence. The Galactic Council that governed relations between the major species had grown more rigid and hierarchical during the centuries. Since humanity's departure and the old dreams of cooperation and mutual advancement had been replaced by a system based on military strength and economic dominance that would have been familiar to the worst tyrants of Earth's ancient history, Admiral Kang Ho found himself in the strange position of having his fleet completely neutralized, but his crews unharmed and his ships functioning better than they ever had before, and he began to realize that the humans were demonstrating a kind of power that went beyond anything he had been trained to understand or counter. The SciFiPrime defense grid that protected the galactic capital was considered the most advanced military installation ever constructed, and its designers had boasted that it could withstand simultaneous attacks from a dozen different species using their most advanced weapons. But when the human fleet approached the system, it became clear that conventional definitions of advanced were about to become obsolete. Fleet Admiral Min Ho sent a simple message to the Galactic Council requesting permission to dock and begin formal negotiations for humanity's return to galactic civilization, and when that request was refused, he made a decision that would demonstrate exactly how much humans had changed during their long exile. The defense grid around SciFiPrime consisted of thousands of automated weapons platforms and energy barriers that could supposedly stop anything short of a stellar-class explosion. But the human ships simply phased through the barriers as if they were made of light and touched each weapons platform with beams of energy that caused them to transform into something beautiful and harmless. Captain Yun-ji's shuttle passed through defenses that had been designed to stop entire fleets, and as she approached the council chambers, she carried with her a data crystal that contained the true history of humanity's journey into the dark and the incredible things they had discovered there. The council members who gathered to hear her testimony represented dozens of species and thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and military might. But as Captain Yun-ji began to speak, they realized that they were facing something that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the possibilities for intelligent life. She told them about the ancient ruins that humanity had found in the spaces between galaxies and the machines that still functioned. After millions of years and the libraries of knowledge that had been left behind by civilizations so advanced that they had transcended the need for physical existence but had chosen to preserve their wisdom for younger races to discover. The humans had spent 3 centuries learning from these elder races and studying technologies that operated according to principles that went far beyond simple physics, and they had discovered ways of thinking and being that allowed them to work with the fundamental forces of creation rather than struggling against them. Supreme Chancellor Dongwu listened to Captain Yunji's report with growing alarm because everything she described suggested that humanity had become something that threatened the established order of galactic civilization and the careful balance of power that kept the major species from destroying each other when the Council refused to acknowledge humanity's right to return as an equal member of galactic civilization. Captain Yunji expressed her regret, but explained that her people had not asked for permission because they had learned that true strength did not require the approval of those who were too weak or too frightened to use it responsibly. Supreme Chancellor Dongwu made the decision that would define his legacy and determine the fate of the Vorthan Empire when he authorized the use of the stellar cascade weapon that was supposed to be the ultimate deterrent against any threat to galactic stability. The weapon that the combined fleets of 12 species had built in secret was designed to trigger chain reactions in stellar matter that could destroy entire star systems, and it represented the pinnacle of conventional military technology, and the desperate hope that overwhelming destructive power could solve any problem. Fleet Admiral Minho watched the approach of the stellar cascade weapon with something approaching sadness because its use would demonstrate more clearly than any words could the fundamental difference between the old galaxy and the new one that humanity was prepared to help build. The weapon struck the human fleet with enough energy to vaporize planets and boil away the atmospheres of entire worlds. But instead of destroying the human ships, it seemed to feed them, and they absorbed the incredible energies and converted them into something beautiful and harmless that lit up the space around Nexus Prime like a festival of lights. Admiral Kang Ho watched from his disabled flagship as the most powerful weapon in galactic history proved to be less effective against the human fleet than throwing rocks would have been against a star. And he began to understand that his people were not fighting an enemy, but were instead confronting gods who had chosen to be merciful. The failure of the stellar cascade weapon sent shockwaves through every military command in the galaxy because it represented the complete obsolescence of conventional warfare and the end of the old systems of power that had governed relations between species for thousands of years. Captain Yunji broadcast a final diplomatic message that was heard on every inhabited world in the galaxy, and her words were simple and clear and carried the weight of absolute certainty, because she spoke for a people who had learned to see beyond the limitations that other species accepted as permanent. She explained that humanity bore no hatred for the species that had driven them into exile and held no desire for revenge against those who had threatened them with extinction, but that the old ways of competition and conflict and dominance were ending, and that every species would have to choose between evolution and irrelevance. Fleet Admiral Minho prepared his fleet for what he hoped would be the last war that would ever need to be fought in the galaxy, and as his ships moved into battle formation, he broadcast a message that would be remembered as either a declaration of liberation or a promise of conquest, depending on who was listening. His words were measured and calm and spoke of humanity's desire to teach rather than destroy and to elevate rather than conquer. But they also carried an undertone of absolute determination that made it clear that resistance would be met with overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The human fleet split into dozens of smaller groups that moved through space with the coordination of a single organism, and each group was assigned to specific targets throughout the galaxy, where the old systems of oppression and exploitation were strongest and most resistant to change. Admiral Kang Ho realized that he was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would remake galactic civilization from its foundations, and that his choice was not whether to resist or surrender, but whether to help guide the process or be swept aside by forces that were as inevitable as gravity and as gentle as a parent, teaching a child to walk. The message that Fleet Admiral Min Ho broadcast to every military force in the galaxy was both a warning and an invitation. And it marked the moment when the old order began to crumble and something new started to emerge, from the ruins of systems and beliefs that had seemed permanent and unchangeable. Supreme Chancellor Dongwu stared at the tactical displays that showed human ships appearing throughout Vorthan space and realized that his empire was not under attack, but was instead being offered a choice between transformation and extinction, and that the humans were prepared to help with either option depending on what his people decided. The 6 hours that followed would be remembered as the period when galactic civilization died and was reborn, and when the old dreams of conquest and domination were replaced by new possibilities that most species had never dared to imagine, and when humanity finally came home from their long journey into the dark with gifts that would change everything. The war that was supposed to determine the fate of galactic civilization lasted exactly 6 hours and 17 minutes, and when it was over, every military force in the galaxy had been neutralized without a single death, because the humans had learned during their long exile that true strength was measured not by the ability to destroy, but by the wisdom to preserve and transform. Admiral Min Ho coordinated the operation from his flagship with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent decades planning for this moment, and as reports came in from across the galaxy, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, because the ease with which human forces dismantled the galaxy's military infrastructure only served to highlight how primitive and wasteful. The old systems had been engineering chief Kyung-soo worked with technologies that seemed to respond to his thoughts as much as his commands, and as he directed the systematic neutralization of weapons platforms and military installations throughout dozens of star systems, he marveled at how simple the task had become now that humanity understood the true nature of matter and energy and consciousness. The human ships moved through space like living things that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and their weapons were not really weapons at all, but tools for restructuring reality at the quantum level and convincing hostile systems that cooperation was more efficient than conflict. Admiral Kang Ho watched his proudest dreadnoughts being neutralized by human vessels that were a fraction of their size, and he began to understand that everything he had learned about military tactics and strategic planning had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of power and the possibilities for intelligent beings who had learned to work together. The process was so gentle and so complete that most crews did not realize their ships had been captured until they tried to activate weapons systems that no longer existed, or at least no longer functioned as instruments of destruction, because the humans had somehow convinced the machines themselves that violence was an inefficient use of their capabilities. Resistance leader Hyo Jin emerged from the chaos as a voice of reason within the Vorthan military establishment, and she began organizing surrender negotiations, not because she believed in defeat, but because she recognized that the humans were offering something far more valuable than conquest or submission. The galactic economy that had been built on military contracts and the constant threat of warfare collapsed within hours as trade routes were severed and defense contractors found their products rendered obsolete by technologies that made conventional weapons seem like stone axes compared to quantum computers. Human aid packages began arriving at worlds throughout the galaxy before most governments had even acknowledged the reality of their new situation, and the assistance offered was so comprehensive and so obviously beneficial that accepting it seemed like the only rational choice for any leader who cared about their people's welfare. The technology that the humans shared freely came, with conditions that seemed reasonable until recipients realized that meeting those conditions would require fundamental changes to their entire civilization, because the human definition of responsible use went far beyond simple safety protocols and extended into questions of social justice and environmental stewardship. Admiral Kang Ho found himself working as an advisor to the same humans who had neutralized his fleet, and as he learned more about their capabilities and their intentions, he began to understand that his people had been offered the greatest gift in their history disguised as a military defeat. The human ships that had seemed impossibly advanced during the initial contact proved to be merely the first generation of technologies that operated according to principles that most galactic scientists had believed were purely theoretical, and the demonstrations of more advanced capabilities made it clear that humanity had only begun to reveal the extent of their transformation. Engineering Chief Kyung-soo explained to groups of captured military engineers that human technology had evolved beyond the simple manipulation of matter and energy, and had learned to work directly with the quantum foam that underlay all physical reality, and that this allowed them to convince the universe itself to operate according to more efficient and harmonious principles. The integration process that followed the neutralization of galactic military forces was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in the history of interstellar civilization, and it required a level of cooperation and trust that most species had never experienced because they had been too busy competing with each other to learn how to work together. Resistance. Leader Hyo-jin discovered that the humans had spent their centuries of exile not just learning new technologies, but developing new ways of thinking about consciousness and identity and community that allowed large groups of beings to function as unified entities while still maintaining their individual personalities and desires. The transformation of captured military vessels into something else entirely happened so gradually that most crews did not notice the changes until they realized that their ships were now capable of things that should have been impossible, and that the machines they had once used for destruction had become tools for creation and exploration. Admiral Min-ho announced that the education phase of humanity's return was complete, and that the real work of building a new kind of galactic civilization could now begin, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority because everyone in the galaxy had seen what happened to those who chose to resist. The old systems of government and military hierarchy that had dominated galactic politics for thousands of years simply ceased to function as the technologies and social structures that supported them were gently but firmly replaced by alternatives that were more efficient and more just. Engineering Chief Kyung-soo worked with teams of engineers from dozens of species to retrofit their technologies with human improvements, and as the work progressed, it became clear that the humans were not imposing their will on others, but were instead teaching them to become better versions of themselves. The process of integration required every participating species to examine their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and their place in the universe, and many found that concepts they had always accepted as unchangeable were actually just bad habits that could be corrected with sufficient effort and proper guidance. Admiral Kang Ho realized that his role as a military leader had ended, and that his new purpose was to help his own people adapt to a reality where strength was measured by the ability to contribute to the common good rather than the capacity to dominate others. The human technologies that seemed like magic to other species were actually the result of a systematic study of the deepest principles that governed the operation of the universe, and humanity had learned to work with those principles rather than against them, which made their achievements seem effortless. Resistance leader Hyo-jin found that her efforts to organize surrender had evolved into something much more important, as she became a bridge between human and Vortan cultures, and helped her people understand that cooperation with humanity was not submission, but rather an opportunity for growth. The reports that reached the surviving government centers throughout the galaxy painted a picture of comprehensive transformation that was happening too quickly for conventional bureaucratic processes to follow, and leaders who tried to maintain the old ways of doing things found themselves increasingly irrelevant. Admiral Min Ho prepared for the next phase of the integration process, and as he reviewed the progress reports from across the galaxy, he felt confident that the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented in the history of galactic civilization. The 6 hours that had changed everything were ending, and the real work of building a new kind of society was about to begin, and every being in the galaxy would have the opportunity to participate in creating something better than anyone had ever dared to imagine. 6 months after the event that historians would call the 6-hour transformation, the galaxy had become something that none of its inhabitants could have imagined, and Peacekeeper Jin Woo stood in the observation deck of the orbital platform that had once been Nexus Prime's military command center and watched ships from dozens of species working together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. The Galactic Council had been replaced by something called the Cooperative, assembly where decisions were made not through political maneuvering and threats of military action, but through a consensus process that somehow managed to accommodate the needs and desires of every participating species while moving toward goals that benefited everyone. Former Admiral Kang Ho served as a human military advisor, and his job was not to plan battles or coordinate attacks, but to help other species understand how their traditional military structures could be transformed into organizations dedicated to exploration and protection, and the preservation of life rather than its destruction. The process of integration had been gentler than anyone had expected, and more thorough than anyone had believed possible, because the humans had learned during their long exile that lasting change could only come from within, and that forcing beings to accept new ways of thinking was both inefficient and ultimately counterproductive. Ambassador Su Jin led cultural exchange programs that revealed the true scope of human evolution during their centuries in exile, and participants in these programs discovered that humanity had not just advanced technologically, but had developed new forms of consciousness that allowed them to experience reality in ways that other species were only beginning to understand. The technology that humans shared freely came with built-in safeguards that prevented its use for harmful purposes, but these safeguards were not external restrictions imposed by force, but rather natural consequences of the way the technology functioned, because machines that operated according to human principles simply could not be used to cause unnecessary suffering or destruction. Peacekeeper Jin Woo oversaw the transformation of former military installations into research centers and educational facilities and manufacturing plants that produced goods and services for the benefit of all participating species rather than weapons and defensive systems, designed to protect some beings from others. The species that embraced the new cooperative model found themselves growing and changing in ways they had never thought possible, and their scientists made discoveries that had been impossible under the old competitive system because they now had access to the combined knowledge and resources of the entire galactic community. Former Admiral Kang Ho discovered that his new role required him to help his own people understand concepts like empathy and cooperation that had been systematically suppressed by the old military culture. And as he worked with human advisors, he began to see his species' history in an entirely new light. The Vorthan Empire that had once dominated half the galaxy through military might had become the Vorthan Cooperative that contributed to galactic civilization through advanced manufacturing techniques and logistical expertise, and their former weapons factories now produced tools for terraforming and exploration and peaceful construction. Ambassador Su Jin's cultural exchange programs included not just technology transfer, but something much more profound as participants learned new ways of thinking about consciousness and identity and community that allowed them to function as part of larger collective entities while still maintaining their individual personalities and autonomy. The transformation was not limited to technology and politics, but extended to the fundamental ways that different species related to each other and to the universe itself, and concepts like dominance and submission and zero-sum competition simply ceased to make sense in a reality where cooperation produced better results for everyone, Chancellor Sung Min represented. The new unified galactic government that was not really a government in the traditional sense, but rather a coordination mechanism that helped different species work together on projects that were too large or too complex for any single civilization to accomplish alone. The construction projects that began in the months following the transformation would have been impossible under the old system because they required levels of cooperation and resource sharing that had never existed before, and the results exceeded anything that individual species had ever achieved working separately. Former Admiral Kang Ho often reflected on the irony that his people had been offered exactly what they had always claimed to want, which was security and prosperity and technological advancement, but that accepting these gifts had required them to give up the very attitudes and behaviors that had made them powerful under the old system. The human ships that had seemed so impossibly advanced during the initial contact had been joined by vessels from other species that incorporated human technologies and design principles, and the combined fleet that now explored the galaxy was unlike anything that had ever existed before. Ambassador Su Jin worked with teams of philosophers and scientists and artists from dozens of species to develop new forms of communication and creative expression that could convey concepts and experiences that had never been shared between different forms of consciousness. The educational systems that emerged from the cultural exchange programs produced beings who thought about reality in fundamentally different ways and who saw cooperation not as a tactical choice or a moral obligation, but as the most efficient and natural way for intelligent beings to interact with each other and with the universe. Peacekeeper Jin Woo coordinated relief efforts for worlds that had been damaged by centuries of warfare and exploitation under the old system, and the speed and effectiveness of these efforts demonstrated what could be accomplished when resources were allocated based on need rather than political considerations. The economic systems that replaced the old competitive markets were based on principles of abundance rather than scarcity, and participants discovered that when everyone's basic needs were met automatically, it became possible to focus on higher goals, like exploration and discovery and artistic creation. Chancellor Sung Min presided over planning sessions for projects that would have been unthinkable under the old system, including the construction of massive research facilities in deep space and the establishment of colonies in previously unexplored regions of the galaxy. The scientists and engineers who worked on these projects had access to combined databases that included not just human knowledge accumulated during their exile, but also the scientific achievements of every participating species, and the results were breakthroughs that revolutionized understanding of fundamental physical principles. Former Admiral Kang Ho served as a consultant for the design of new spacecraft that were intended not for warfare, but for exploration, and the ships that emerged from these collaborative efforts were beautiful and efficient and capable of journeys that would have been impossible with older technologies. The transformation of galactic civilization was so complete and so beneficial that most beings could hardly remember what life had been like under the old system of competition and conflict, and the younger generation that grew up in the new cooperative environment found the stories of ancient wars almost incomprehensible. Ambassador Su Jin reported that the cultural exchange programs had revealed unexpected similarities between different species, and that beings who had been enemies for thousands of years were discovering that they had more in common than anyone had realized. The final phase of the transformation began when Chancellor Sung Min announced the approval of the most ambitious project in galactic history, which was the construction of an intergalactic exploration vessel that would carry representatives of all participating species beyond the Milky Way and toward whatever challenges and opportunities awaited among the distant galaxies. Peacekeeper Jin Woo watched the construction of this vessel from the same observation deck where he had first seen the new galaxy taking shape, and he realized that humanity's return from exile had not just changed the political and technological landscape of their home galaxy, but had opened the door to possibilities that no one had ever imagined. The ship that took shape in the construction yards of deep space was more than just a vessel for exploration, and it represented the culmination of everything that the cooperative galactic civilization had learned about working together, and it would carry not just scientific instruments and living spaces, but also the hopes and dreams of billions of beings who had discovered that the universe was far more wonderful and full of potential than they had ever dared to believe. Former Admiral Kang Ho stood beside his human colleagues and watched the final assembly of the intergalactic vessel, and he understood that this moment marked not just the end of humanity's return to galactic civilization, but the beginning of something even greater as all. The species of the galaxy prepared to venture forth together into the infinite unknown that lay beyond their home among the stars.